Sound is just pieces of air wiggling. Our ear is super sensitive to this wiggly air, so when we feel a change in air pressure, our brain interprets it as sound. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, sound has a lot of wonderful uses, like talking and screaming, but perhaps the most intriguing of these uses is music. As any person who gives it much thought would realize, music is kinda weird. I mean, it's just a bunch of air wiggles that for some reason we enjoy. Air could wiggle all kinds of different ways, and yet musicians only use very specific ones to avoid unpleasant sounds. So, I'd like to show you how the West, rightly so or not, managed to narrow down every sound to ever exist to just 12 tone scales. First, let's establish some ground level information about these air wiggles before looking at how they were interpreted throughout history. So, what exactly is a note? The simplest form of a note is a sine wave, or as it's more traditionally known, a fundamental. As we've already talked about, sound is just air moving, running into our eardrums. Our eardrums then move around as well, and depending on the speed and strength of all those wiggles, our brain interprets it as sound. The most common way to represent a sine wave is with a series of peaks and valleys, each peak representing a point of high pressure and each valley low pressure. If this series keeps repeating consistently, then we have a note. To find the pitch of that note, all you need to do is count how many of these peaks pass a given point in a second. The space between each peak, or vibration of sound, is referred to as a cycle. Just like we might measure the speed in miles per hour, we can measure sound in cycles per second, which is known as hertz. So if you had two waves, one moving 2 cycles per second and the other 4, it wouldn't just create an easily understandable visual pattern, but also an auditory one. In this example, we could explain the proportion between these two notes by saying that they're in a 2-to-1 relationship. One section of air is wiggling at exactly twice the speed of the other. The more complicated these ratios get, the more off-putting or dissonant this sounds to us. This particular ratio of 2-to-1 is the simplest ratio you can find, and is referred to as an octave. These notes sound so harmonious together that we refer to two notes an octave apart as being the same note. So, to make a song, you just control various levels of entropy in your sound, creating more tension or less tension as these ratios grow more or less complex, increasing resolve as they simplify, and increasing entropy, dissonance, chaos as they grow more and more convoluted. Essentially, you're playing with a natural human desire for resolve. The musician can then create an emotional story arc by interpreting and manipulating our subconscious. However, too much dissonance starts sounding random because our brain can't understand what pattern is there anymore. It gets random to the point where our brain stops interpreting the sound as music and simply as sound like any other to be dealt with. Now, like any concept hastily explained, there are complications. See, when air wiggles, it also wiggles the air around it, creating a butterfly effect of wiggles, wiggling everywhere. This means that unlike a sine wave, when you hear a note, you also hear a series of much quieter notes going up in pitch, infinitely theoretically. These are called overtones. This is why, if I play this note versus this note, they sound different. They're the same note because the loudest, the fundamental, is the same. However, they sound distinct from one another because of their contrasting overtone series, all those little quiet notes above them. At any rate, most musicians aren't thinking about all of this when they play, just like how you don't think about how you're going to push air out of your mouth when you speak. Instead, you think about the words you want. So, the solution to this is to create a vocabulary for the musician, a scale or a sequence of notes which is predetermined. It will provide a framework for the musician to work within, so he doesn't have to pick out of every sound in existence and focus on avoiding this entropy the whole time. Instead, he can pick sounds which he knows have certain relationships. However, with which notes these are so far from a simple question to answer. I mean, people have been trying to for years and we still can't. So, for the rest of this video, I intend to walk you through some of the basic scales, modes, and tuning systems which have been used and fought over throughout the ages. Be warned, this is no laughing matter. Pythagoras literally killed someone who disagreed with him on this. So, yeah, watch out. Well, an endless number of ways to decide what note you want to play are available. A very common tuning, named after its creator, Pythagoras, was the most popular in the West until roughly the 15th century. This system chooses a note's tuning based on the interval of the perfect fifth, which is a 2-to-3 ratio. The problem with this system arises when a musician wants the octave. In modern thinking, our notes can be represented on a circle, the circle of fifths. This circle consists of, not surprisingly, a bunch of fifths stacked on top of each other until they reach an octave. But tuning by perfect fifths, this concept is just unachievable. An octave is two notes with the simplest and most harmonious ratio, 2 to 1. Stack 11 fifths, we come closest to the octave, but not quite there. As it turns out, you can't stack 2/3 ratios and end up with a 1/2 ratio. You end up playing this very unsatisfying interval between the first and the 12th note of this system, which is referred to today as the wolf fifth, or just a wolf interval. So, this system provides the perfect fifth, which many consider to be the most important to musical composition, but the third, for example, which is often thought of as the next most important, is almost unusably out of tune. This imperfect system was often just worked around by the individual. In this time period, tunings would a lot of times be specified to the notes needed for the purpose of the particular song. The notes needed to be played in a piece would be the ones in tune, instead of all of the notes. The standardized tuning that we've been talking about was used primarily within large organizations, where everyone needs to be able to play the same thing, most notably the church. See, within a church or a concert hall at this time could be found instruments which were seldom seen elsewhere, keyboard instruments such as an organ, harpsichord, or even a piano. Unlike a lute, instruments with keyboards have a limited number of pitches available on them. If you have two notes next to each other, then no note in between them are playable on an organ, both because of instruments like these and a desire for a universal connection to sound the same wherever you go. The church was the primary home of this tuning during this century. So, if Pythagorean tuning has so many frustrations, why don't we just use a different tuning? Well, my well-learned friend, that's exactly what people did. Moving forward in time, towards the mid-16th century, a new temperament became popular, mean tone, and quarter comma mean tone, which is very similar. Knowing that we can only hear with a certain level of precision, mean tone temperament compromises the purity of the fifths very slightly, which allows the other notes to be in tune. The idea being that a small enough change will make little difference to our imprecise ears. If this is done in the extreme, it's called quarter comma mean tone. This is where the fifths are adjusted so much that the third is perfectly in tune. However, this more extreme system was rarely used. Instead, the Renaissance period opted for slightly out of tune thirds and fifths, but to a degree where it's really not that noticeable. Since major thirds are the most purely in tune in this system, it was standard practice to end on a major third everything. When done in a minor key, this creates a strange effect, which is known as the Picardy third. You might have heard of it. It's the sound that's so inseparable with the Renaissance period. It's interesting to note that while mean tone is often associated with the Renaissance, not everyone back then played in this tuning. Many sources suggest that while keyboard instruments, which would be found in ballrooms, wealthy houses, and churches, were tuned this way, Many fretted string instruments, like the lute again, were tuned in equal temperament, the tuning we most commonly use today. Well, as time moved on, people evolved and so did their musical styles. Over about the next 100 years, musical styles became increasingly dissonant from what they were in the Romantic period. This led to accidentals being played way more often. To accommodate this, a preference was adopted when tuning, a method which allowed every sharp to be the flat of the note above it. This preference enables composers to delve outside of the key they're in while still maintaining a sound consonant enough with the key that it remains understandable. They used temperaments for of only 12 pitches that tolerated the use of different notes with the same pitches. This does include equal temperament, but a lot more popular at the time were these irregular temperaments. Irregular temperaments, as you would guess, vary wildly in form based on the piece of music. A composer using a temperament of 12 pitches might play an E flat a lot less than an A. In this case, the tuning to go with would include very harmonious A's and less harmonious E flats. Of course, which notes a composer wants more or less dissonant depend on the kind of contextual factors outside of frequency. In Velotti's temperament tunes all of the white keys from F to B in 6 comma mean tone, which gives them a very consonant third at the expense of the fifths being more dissonant. However, the rest of the fifths are in Pythagorean tuning, meaning that the composer has perfect fifths but extremely dissonant thirds. While having the same interval with substantially different dissonance may sound unnecessarily cumbersome to the modern musician, it has its place. With these mixed tuning systems, a variety of contrasts are available which otherwise wouldn't be. In all the other systems we've covered, once the listener hears the interval, it's set at whatever ratio it is. A third is always the same distance from, well, the other thirds that it is no matter where you play it on the piano. The notes are the same distance from each other. But in irregular temperament, that ratio is subject to change throughout the range of the song. Composing with this tool in mind can lead composers to much more engaging and varied music because it keeps the audience on their toes. They never know what's coming next, so they're forced to pay attention and understand the emotional difference between a third with more or less difference. Now, this change, this complexity would otherwise have been impossible and would have greatly changed the modern influences we have. The moment you've all been waiting for, we've made it to equal temperament. This is the tuning we use today. It's a system of tuning where the interval between every note is the same. This means that every single interval, except for the octave, is out of tune. The advantage to this is that our ears adjust really quickly to the flaws because every note is equally out of tune. Now, strictly speaking, as we went over earlier, when we say out of tune, we only mean out of tune with the harmonic series. That's all those quiet notes that play above your main note, which you hear not realizing they're separate. And this is very natural to humanity. When we want to find a noise, we go to the harmonic series. Take the universally used chant children have teased each other with. It goes like this: na 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 na. That's pretty straightforward, but that's the harmonic series. Those are the first two notes in the harmonic series, and so they sound the most consonant with each other. They're the easiest for us to go to. Now, this is just one example, but the harmonic series shows up all over if you just keep your ears open for it. So, if the harmonic series sounds so in tune, why do we use equal temperament? Well, there's the obvious reason, which people have been trying to avoid since we left Pythagorean tuning in the first place, which is that you simply can't get every note in tune. But there's a broader reason, which I think may have more to do with why we don't use one of those other systems, which is accessibility. Music has become more easily accessible throughout time. We don't have to go pay for an opera, sit through an opera to enjoy it. We can pull it up on our phone or even walk down the street and hear a busker playing. Now, this accessibility to music is new. It's very new, and it means that on a broader scale, more and more people get deeply interested in music and want to play it. And having a system where you don't have to worry about the tuning, where everything is intuitively about the same, so you don't have to know the differences, you don't have to play by tuning, you play by note, is very important. More practically, this is achievable now because of modern technology. Trying to tune by ear, it is nearly impossible to play an equal temperament even if you want to, meaning that without an electronic tuner, it's very hard to actually be perfectly an equal temperament. So these two factors are why we use it today. If you'd like to hear some more modern music which uses other tunings and temperaments, it is definitely out there. Two bands which have experimented with this are Stargazer and Jacob Collier, who I guess isn't really a band. I highly recommend listening to Jacob Collier. He's incredibly good, and I love him in the depths of my heart. But beside the point, listen to the music around you, see how it's changed, and be aware of what you're listening to. Don't be so passive about it. Okay, I'm done talking. I hope you have a good rest of your day.